Hey guys, welcome to the latest fireside chat from Fintech Book Club. And by latest, I also mean second ever because that's how things start and how you get them off the ground. It says Maya's MacBook Pro here. I don't know why, but it's true. I am recording this on my MacBook Pro. So now you know, I think it's going to blink there the whole time. Sorry about that. With this fireside chat, so Eric M. Jackson is the author of The PayPal Wars, the most recent book we read. We featured him, and I was so excited to talk to Jackson that I really just jumped in, which is why I wanted to give you guys a little bit of background and a little bit of intro here. Now, of course, everyone read the book, but just in case you didn't, to refresh you, The PayPal Wars is kind of the origin story, unofficial, as told by Jackson, who was one of the first employees. So as an early employee, he talks about his experiences joining the company on his first day of work. No one even knew that he was supposed to be here. He didn't have a desk. I think he ended up sitting in the ping pong room. And he talks about how PayPal started. It was a pivot. I didn't know. PayPal, a pivot. It just feels like the most obvious idea in the world to me. So I had no idea that they kind of had to, use some lean startup methodologies and find their way to true product market fit. So when PayPal started, it was actually a secure way to send data in between Palm Pilots. People had Palm Pilots, right? And it just so turns out if you have a secure way to send data, one of the best uses of that is sending money. So they were bought / kind of merged with X.com, which was Elon Musk's neobank circa 2000. And the original plan was that PayPal, as this cool lightweight money movement, would be the really cheap way of acquiring customers, and then they'd upsell them into X.com. And they're really going to monetize this whole business based off of X.com's banking product. So if it seems like PayPal doesn't really have a good business model and started without a great business model, that's true. And if it seems like they were focused on growth, that's also true. Now, they turned it into a really big company without the X.com banking services on top, but that's kind of why it took the shape that it did. The rest of the PayPal Wars is really about them going head to head with eBay and eBay's own bill point solution for checkout. Even though eBay had all of the distribution advantages, PayPal out-executed them and really did a better job of listening to their users and providing value, which is why PayPal kind of won out. Jackson talks about PayPal going public and then eventually even being acquired by eBay. My favorite parts of our fireside chat, though, was really when we were talking about the things that are happening now, right? So in many ways, Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are manifesting the vision that PayPal had 20 years ago. And that vision that Peter Thiel got everyone really excited about and bringing a universal form of money movement to the globe, we're now seeing that happen in different ways. And somewhat ironically, PayPal actually just announced support for buying cryptocurrency. Jackson really thinks that this is going to help pave the way for the masses to get involved in cryptocurrency since they can buy it just through PayPal. Anyway, so we talk about stuff that happened 20 years ago. We talk about lessons for startups. We talk about stuff that's happening today. It's a really fun chat, and I think you're going to like it a lot. So please enjoy. Hop right in. Eric, I don't know if we talked about this before, but I actually have a long history with eBay and a very personal relationship with PayPal and some of these stories. So I started selling things on eBay when I was 11. And I was actually, so it was back when it was a problem that you described with money orders in the mail. And I had to lie about my age to qualify for a PayPal account, which actually still causes me some problems now. But it was so cool for me personally to kind of hear the other side of the story for something that was really part of my growing up. So thanks for writing it.
You're welcome. So you found out the rationale for all the annoying things that PayPal did to you as you were trying to use it, right?
Right. There was a good reason behind all of that.
It always is.
Yeah, and since I've read your book, which was just in the past month, I've also recommended it to a whole bunch of startup founders because I think the story of PayPal starting with beaming information between Palm Pilots and then pivoting into the payments company we know is really aspirational for a lot of founders who are maybe struggling to find product market fit. And I'm keep going. PayPal didn't have the idea it became into from the start either.
Yeah, that's true. I think, it's lost on a lot of people now when you look back and the company's a big success, has done, all the things it's done over the last 20 years. And it's easy to forget that there were like so many miscalculations when we started. And in fact, when you think about it, there were actually two really huge pivots just in the first year there. Both the focus, sort of like the go-to-market focus, moving from person-to-person payments to really being more of like a B2C payment portal, payment platform, as well as the actual platform itself that we were built on, because we were originally focused a lot more on handheld devices. And in those days, that meant Palm Pilots, right? I mean, we're talking 1999. It's the right idea. Just it was too early. We didn't have these yet. And so moving from that, with the website almost being an afterthought, to really building around the web was kind of the second pivot. So really, when you think about it, both the distribution strategy and the platform were wrong. So two major changes right out of the gate.
Right, right. Well, and I'm excited that we're getting right into it. I want to make sure, so everyone here, right, we're talking with Eric M. Jackson, author of The PayPal Wars, serial entrepreneur, now founder and CEO of CapLinked. And since you bring up the product changed, the market changed, kind of the distribution, I want to hop right into that. So PayPal now owns Venmo, but in many ways they started with Palm Pilots and mobile devices. They kind of missed this new rise of mobile. And I was curious, like, what you thought of that, right? And why didn't PayPal continue to innovate and see where the ship was sailing?
Well, that's a really good question, actually. I mean, I think in defense of PayPal, most Web 1.0 companies didn't get that good at mobile, right? I mean, there are really only a few that I think jumped into it and did a really good job with it. I mean, Amazon for sure made that transition. Facebook did. They weren't really a Web 1.0, but I mean, they were still kind of pre-mobile when they launched, doing a lot of their early growth in '04 or '05. But they made that transition because they actually said, like, we're going to be mission focused around just doing that. But there really aren't that many companies that did it. So in some sense, you can kind of forgive PayPal from not evolving product wise and just sort of doing this shift through acquisition and through growing their company through the marketplace rather than building the product organically. So they're not alone in that sense. But I think also broadly speaking that PayPal's trajectory changed a lot over the years. In the years following the departure of the original team, that focus went from creating and building something new to just really expanding what they had. And so it sort of makes sense that they would use acquisitions of companies like Venmo and others to accomplish those needs and meet those needs out in the marketplace, rather than just build it all internally. So I think it's part of the a company's natural lifestyle. I think it's the culture shifted a lot under eBay. eBay was a lot less product focused than I think PayPal was at the time of the acquisition. So a cultural change with turnover, and just again, benefit of the doubt is that most companies that were Web 1.0 did not really make a tremendous jump over to mobile.
Right, right. And you talked about how PayPal also shifted from primarily being P2P to really doing a lot of B2C payments. And certainly when I think about going out to dinner with my friends, if my friend pays for it, I don't say, oh, I'll PayPal you, though I certainly could. And I'm curious, if you could talk a little bit about that and why that is.
Yeah, and that's a really great point, because that was actually kind of the initial vision of PayPal, was that Venmo, like Venmo 20 years ago. So that idea that people could pull out some sort of digital device and settle up on a debt, almost have like the equivalent of like your wallet that you could carry around with you electronically. And that felt revolutionary at the time, but the infrastructure just wasn't there for it, right? So with Palm Pilots, they weren't ubiquitous. I mean, maybe in the echo chamber of Silicon Valley, you know a lot of people that might have one, but even then, that was still far from ubiquitous, and they were also asynchronous. So you didn't have that ability to have immediate connectivity and updates. For those of you that are old enough to remember, and I saved my Palm, I've still got it around somewhere, just as it's like a paperweight just to kind of remember that time. But you'd actually have to take the device and like plug it into a cradle and sync it with your computer, which hopefully was connected to the internet, and wouldn't necessarily always be, because you might have a dial-up modem on the other end of it. So it was an incredibly asynchronous process to settle. So there were a lot of reasons why that wasn't ideal, and of course for that kind of in-person electronic transfers of cash, you did need to have like a device with you. The idea that you're going to remember that and go back to your computer later on and dial into your PayPal account, it just wasn't a useful user experience. Like the workflow for that just wasn't good. So that's why I think the PayPal really didn't take off as much in that direction. Whereas, as you described earlier with your own experiences selling on eBay, there was actually like a pressing need in that market. And so that B2C route, connecting consumers with small businesses that were using eBay as a distribution platform, ended up being a lot more natural. And that was our go-to-market pivot that we figured out early on as a way to scale the business.
Right, because that was actually like a very painful hair on fire problem, In the world of problems, not a vitamin, but a painkiller. It was cool to read though about the original idea of the X.com merger, at least, which was planning on using PayPal's peer-to-peer payments and their crazy growth to like bring in lots of customers through the front door and then upsell them on X.com's financial products. I feel like we hit rinse and repeat with what we see today with Venmo and Cash App, right? Where now those platforms are using peer-to-peer payments to get in people for cheap through the front door, and then they're trying to upsell them on financial products. Do you think now is the right time for this, or is that gonna kind of fail to cross the chasm?
That's a good question, right? It seems like maybe it was another one of those things that PayPal was trying to do that was ahead of its time, and it just needed the ecosystem to kind of catch up with it. For anyone that wasn't familiar with that aspect of PayPal's history that I wrote about in my book, the idea was that PayPal would be this growth mechanism, kind of this lightweight payment service, and that X.com, which was the company that Elon Musk founded, would provide the banking services that could then monetize this free payment service. And there's a lot of reasons why that was kind of a problematic idea, because I think at the time it wasn't clear that people that were signing up to use PayPal were necessarily looking for banking services, right? Because you didn't have this P2P world. Since it was more B2C, you really had consumers that were using it basically to process credit card and bank account payments to a merchant. So they weren't really looking for anything else. They just needed a vehicle to send that money over to the merchant. The merchant in this case being a small business that didn't have a merchant account. They didn't necessarily have the sophistication to go and get a direct account to process credit cards. And so they had cash management and inventory needs, but it wasn't necessarily that for consumers. So there's a bit of miscalculation or misunderstanding about what would be the right bundle of services to serve the audience. There also was, I think, a misunderstanding of like the fundamental economics that were involved in payments. And this sounds ridiculous now, right? You look back and you think, okay, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, some of the smartest guys in tech, and how did they get these questions wrong, right? But this idea that we would have enough money that would stay in the ecosystem, that would have made effectively a cost-free payments.
That myth perpetuates today. Everyone gets this wrong. They're like, this is going to be a great business. We've got payments and we're going to make interest off the float. And it's not a good business.
Yeah. Instead, it ends up you're losing like 300 basis points on this from the combination of the credit card fees as well as the fraud losses, right? So, a couple hundred basis points out on the credit cards and another 100 basis points or so out on fraud, which I think I mentioned in my book was almost like an R&D expense for PayPal in those early days as we were trying to figure all that out. So so you had that on the cost side, like we were just fundamentally wrong with that, right? It turned out reality was not what we expected, um, and that's okay. That's pretty normal for startups, right? You have a hypothesis, you go to market, you're testing it. The issue with PayPal was that it scaled phenomenally fast, and so being a little bit wrong with your hypothesis about like the economics involved becomes that becomes amplified really quickly because the business just grew so fast. So in some sense you could even the smartest guys like Peter and Elon, they're not going to get everything right, and it just turned out in PayPal's experience, because they caught lightning in a bottle and it grew so fast, it amplified those mistakes. The other thing I should mention that was happening was at the same time where you had these costs that we weren't expecting. There really was no chance to monetize the float. Not only was there not that kind of there really wasn't that much float in the system. Like most of the money was going out because you didn't have these P2P payments that just go round and round and round, get exchanged from one person to another. Instead, you've got really these many to one payments all being aggregated up by solitary recipients that would then take the money out for their business so they could buy inventory or whatever else. And then interest rates also had this really annoying thing. It's easy to think that in today's environment that like 0% interest rates are normal. You've even got negative interest rates in much of the world, but it was not normal back in that period of time. In fact, you'd had really high interest rates in the late 90s, and then all of a sudden, those had to go very close to not zero, but they dropped dramatically. So even the ability to make money off of float, if you had float, went away. So there was just everything was wrong, right? Both sides of the equation, the cost side, the expense side, as well as the revenue side. We just had all these assumptions wrong, and it got magnified by the rapid growth that PayPal experienced.
That, yeah, I work at Chime and people get their paychecks deposited, and we often have customers complaining that we are holding on to their paychecks and not giving them access to it so that we can make money off the float. And I always want to, right, it's like, if only you knew how little this was worth. Like for us to keep your paycheck for an hour or whatever they're accusing us of it being late by, and today, right, also very low interest environment.
Right.
So
Yeah,
it's a common myth.
Yeah, it's a common myth, and so PayPal just went to market with this a number of assumptions that again were wrong, but the assumptions themselves made sense like circa 1999. So the idea that having a suite of financial service options that could be layered on top of basically a cost-free or slightly profitable payment system that didn't have transaction fees, that there was a certain logic to it. It did make sense, and it wasn't just people like Peter and Elon that thought that. You had a lot of venture capitalists put a lot of money into the company that believed it too as something that was feasible. So there were a lot of people that were wrong, but ultimately they were a lot more right than they were wrong, even though those points didn't quite
Well,
pan out.
that's the thing. You kind of list, you're like, well, they were wrong about this and they were wrong about that, but feels like it kind of worked out for PayPal. And this strategy, I kind of think PayPal is a lot of the reason why the strategy of grow fast at all costs and kind of figure out the details later is so common in Silicon Valley. We've also seen that fail pretty catastrophically recently, right? Like I'm thinking about WeWork and some other startups like that. Do you think that still works out to prioritize growth over figuring out all the details of product, market, business fit, and that those are just anomalies that have extended themselves? Or what's your take on that? How that's
Wow. Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think so much of it's dependent on unit economics and really what the nature of the business is. Because when you're talking about something that has a network effect, then that still holds true in most cases, right? So if you're building some sort of a marketplace or you've got some other type of platform that can operate more profitably at scale, then that certainly makes that often makes sense. But it's not true, I think, uniformly for SaaS or for consumer-facing products, where it really does come down to the unit economics and just understanding, what does the cost look like. You can think about a business like Amazon, for example, right? And I think there's a lot of confusion about what Amazon does, but they ran at a massive deficit for many years,
Right.
and the point was that they were developing scale. So they understood their unit economics. They understood how to get the cost of goods sold down, and to further monetize their individual customers. So that was going on behind the scenes, and they did understand that.
Right. Like they kind
But
of
yeah,
understood their business in a way that maybe WeWork never did.
right, right. And I think that PayPal's story kind of cuts both ways, right? Because PayPal had a network effect, then the sort of like the negative economics and the fact that the business model was broken and needed to be fixed in that first year. Um, you know, we were able to do that. The cost of capital was also cheap, at least for the majority of the founding. It became harder to acquire after, say, 2001. But in those early days, the cost of capital was cheap, so you could actually get a lot of capital at good valuations, and even though there was dilution, it maybe made more sense. So, like, all those factors are actually really important to think about.
Hmm.
So, growth at any cost is it's not a good idea. It really depends on the specifics of the business and the unit economics of the business.
Right. And I also, we talked about like some mistakes in starting assumptions and things like that. But in the book, it really seems like the PayPal team certainly like out executed eBay at every turn. Like even though eBay had this distribution advantage, the PayPal team, right? It's like they were building features better. They were listening to their users. They were sort of out executing them on being a startup. And one of the questions that made me think of is, so one, the execution skill is worth a lot. But do you think if eBay had kind of had it together a little bit more, would PayPal still be in the position it's in today?
Yeah, I think that's a valid question, and the simple answer is maybe not. Um, Now, first of all, when you look back at like who the people were at PayPal, you can understand why the execution was so good. Obviously, Peter and Elon, but beyond that, Max Levchin, Affirm, Chad Hurley, YouTube, Reid Hoffman, LinkedIn. I mean, you guys know the list, the roster of people. So you had an enormous stable of talent, and the ability to execute. It's not a given, but we understood execution as being a priority. We also understood the product as being a priority. So to the extent that you have talented people and you build a system that's really focused on those two things, executing on the product and treating the product as more important than other aspects of your business, then I think you're going to win more often than not.
Right.
That and also the fact that I think PayPal probably doesn't get enough credit for having like a prototype of like lean startup methodology before that was widely known. Waterfall development is, it's still used in some places and in some industries makes sense, particularly, larger corporations, less dynamic markets, existing products that frankly you should maybe iterate slowly on because there's a great degree of customer dependence on it. So longer, slower development cycles can make more sense. But PayPal was doing a form of lean development before you had Eric Ries, before you had Steve Blank and others that have actually given a more robust intellectual methodology to this idea of having shorter development cycles, being much more customer centric, getting feedback and testing hypotheses. So that was really a form of what we were doing. And even if we didn't have the explicit methodology of it, we were adhering much more closely to that. So I think that actually is something that is an important part of PayPal's legacy, is that we were one of the advocates of that early on, and really we're able to prove that out, and we're able to out execute eBay. eBay had every advantage in the world with their own payment system. Why couldn't they get their own small businesses to adopt it? I mean, that's a really good question, right? They had the system. They had purchased BillPoint early on. They had Wells Fargo as a partner with that service. So they had various integration benefits.
I know
And yet,
part of me is wondering if they were just distracted, because they were also running an auction business. And that maybe, I think today we also see, right, there's all these new alternative checkout options. Like
mhm.
there's checkout with Amazon and Shop Pay and stuff like that. Um, so part of me wonders if payments is like so specific and sophisticated that it actually makes sense to not be bundled with the retailer because, right, eBay was distracted running auctions. Everybody else is distracted, like, making t-shirts and selling those. Like maybe payments is just too complicated to bring into the fold.
I feel like the market's actually already proven that statement to be true. So I think what you said is largely correct, right? And I mean, even internally, once eBay acquired PayPal at the end of 2002, over the following decade, PayPal just continued to grow and outgrew eBay. And so I think that subsequent breakup of the two and spin off of PayPal, and then PayPal's market cap being, I haven't looked recently, how many multiples of eBay's, I think just kind of proves your point, right? That they fundamentally are very different. That being said, at the time, it probably did make sense to combine them. Um, I had hesitancy about it back then, as I wrote in the book. But I think it made more sense than not. In part because PayPal just had a lot of systemic risk from having like 7 out of 10 customers coming from one source. So you have a great degree of dependence, and so there's kind of like business risk that maybe made sense for that combination. But ultimately, though, I mean, eBay was in a different field. They weren't focused as well on payments. They didn't take the time to understand it as well. And they also, I think, miscalculated by trying to force an inferior product onto their user base. I think ultimately people are smart. They'll pay attention to things that matter to them. If you're running a small business and you're very dependent on eBay as your channel, then you're going to focus on using the better solution and focus on what your customers want to use. So I think that's why they got pushed back, and ultimately they failed with BillPoint and had to begrudgingly purchase PayPal.
Well, and the like lean startup and listening to your users, listening to their problems, particularly the stories about how involved the PayPal team was with the forums, I thought was really cool. And just what you're saying, like quite ahead of its time. Now we have, like social media response teams, and there's all this specialized software. And I imagine that you guys didn't have any tools or didn't have a playbook, and we're just sort of out there meeting your users where they were at. And it seemed like the response from that was pretty positive.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, we had to develop a lot of tools in house to manage various aspects of PayPal. I mean, it's pretty widely known that sort of some of the earlier prototypes of Palantir style technology were being developed at PayPal. So that idea of having tools to visually track nodes for payments and things like that that were integral kind of idea starters for what would eventually become Palantir. Had to be built from the ground up inside PayPal because there wasn't any set of tools to do that at the time. And you're right. While social media is no longer new, it's old, and it's kind of just taken for granted that that's part of any company, even a B2B company's strategy today is to have like a social media presence. It was still a pretty novel concept for us to engage directly with our customers. But you know what? It led to a lot of that product innovation. And I think that besides the fact that it probably helped us gain supporters and certainly created advocates for PayPal, it didn't just benefit us from a marketing perspective, but it also really did help us from a product R&D perspective to understand what our customers needed and to make the product better.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, I think the book is just details like really excellent product decisions, right? And like specifically, I say decisions as a representation of the process. It's not like there was like this genius insight that you just delivered on. It was like really this process of using the data available to you, iterating. Like it felt like the sand was shifting under your feet all the time, reacting to the moves that eBay was making. And then yeah, the team is obviously famous in terms of being the PayPal mafia. What was that, right? Like, is it just that the PayPal hiring process chose people that would have been great no matter if they were at PayPal or not, or was there something in the water?
Well, that's a good question. Like the book of Proverbs, I think, says iron sharpens iron, and I think that's really true. When you have a talented team, that's what they attract. I think that A players want to play with A players, as kind of the saying goes. But I think there was more than that, right? I think you had kind of the initial use of professional networks. So Max Levchin bringing in really talented people that he was connected to from the University of Illinois. Peter Thiel bringing in a lot of his Stanford connections on the business side. So you had people that had other options, but they were excited about coming to the company, and so you established a good base. But I think there were a lot of things that actually assisted with kind of growing that team and keeping the quality level high subsequent to that. Certainly culture was part of that. Timing was part of it too. When you think about what was going on back in 2000, for those of you that weren't in the industry at that point in time, it was really tumultuous because you'd had this rapid inflation of tech, particularly through, like, if you kind of measure it through the NASDAQ, which is tech tracking indicator, that grew just at a stratospheric rate back in 99 and early 2000. And then as for a lot of reasons, but as the Fed was tightening monetary policy, for one thing, you had this immediate and sudden crash that deflated asset values really, really quickly throughout Silicon Valley. And you might think about like, oh, okay, NASDAQ, publicly traded companies, that shadow that it cast hit private startups pretty rapidly. And you had a major deep recession going into 2001. And then that, of course, was exacerbated by 9/11 happening later in that year. So you really had like a really bad time in Silicon Valley's history for a couple of years there, from mid to late 2000 through 2002. And that meant PayPal was one of the few companies that was growing and prospering during that time. We really could choose the best people
right.
to
So
come
it was like
work
a little
for
bit
us.
less competitive for the top talent.
Yeah. So I think timing mattered in part too. So you had quality people brought in. You had a good culture. That culture encouraged people to grow. There was a real sense of growth mindset. Again, even before that was popularized, but that was certainly part of what we had, a very egalitarian, debate-oriented culture where the idea of learning and growing and becoming your best self were, if not explicitly extolled, were at least implicitly parts of what we were doing. And then, the timing effect of just having kind of the choice of the best people. So all those things, I think, led to PayPal having an outsized number of really talented people that have gone on to make their mark in the years since.
Well, and I wonder if the timing also led to people having a really high risk tolerance, like because there had just been the boom and then the crash, the only people willing to join an internet startup maybe were like a little bit bolder or had a little bit more confidence in their ability to manifest something good, or something a little bit special, given the recent .com crash.
I'm sure that had something to do with it. I mean, the culture around the crash was just so profound. I mean, I certainly noted a lot of anecdotes about that in my book. I mean, just even thinking back, that one of the most popular websites in the Valley in those days was Effed Company. I'm not saying the full name of it, but everyone knows what I'm talking about. And just the idea that there was this really popular blog that everyone had to check out every day to see what's the latest dirt on what company's going to fail today. It just tells you something about what was going on, right? That's really kind of gallows humor, but it was very pervasive because just so many companies were failing. And there's plenty of examples, plenty of poster children to look back at now and kind of laugh about. Webvan or Pets.com, companies which, frankly, there are business models that have succeeded, in the years since, but that were overcapitalized and scaled too quickly and didn't have business models, and so they didn't survive the downturn. But there was a lot of gloom and doom, and it did scare a lot of people away. So I think that I'm sure that was a factor as well when you look at the roster that Peter and Max were able to put together.
Interesting. Another example of PayPal being ahead of its time, I feel like, is now being heralded in with Bitcoin and other blockchain-based cryptocurrencies, particularly this vision that you talk about where Peter laid out a currency that was outside of government jurisdiction and would allow like anyone in the globe to transact and sort of like save them from whatever their government was up to. How does it feel to kind of like watch that rise today in contrast to having been so close to the original vision for that?
It's interesting, and I think there's a direct connection there, in the sense that we had this vision of building a new world currency, as we called it. The idea that we could have this platform that would empower people so that they wouldn't be caught in situations where their government could seize their assets, or in the case of the late 90s, I mean, you had a lot of countries that were freezing withdrawals from bank accounts because they were essentially in these inflationary spirals, and so they were trying to clamp down on that artificially by preventing runs on banks and preventing currency from flooding the market. And of course, the flip side of that, that sounds great, but in reality, what that did was just screw a lot of people over by wiping out the value of their savings. And so that was really kind of inspirational for us in a lot of ways to think like, well, we can empower people to have this electronic platform, but there's a limit to what you can empower when it's a fiat currency. And effectively, PayPal is sort of a centralized platform dealing with fiat currencies, hit those limitations. So it didn't really achieve that full vision. So crypto is interesting because it really does speak to that, right? I mean, it's kind of at the heart of Bitcoin, as well as a number of cryptocurrencies that have kind of seized on this idea of how do you empower individuals and give them something that truly just can't be controlled by anyone. There's no ability of a central government anywhere to really completely control that. And so there's some weird way it's coming full circle now that PayPal has turned on the feature for purchasing crypto, right? And maybe that's not explicit. It's maybe just opportunistic on their part now. But it is interesting now that they've effectively become an on-ramp for cryptocurrency. So we'll see what that ultimately does over time. But there's definitely a sense that crypto has that potential. And there's a lot of shortcomings with crypto. I mean, we could get into all that, but it certainly has like some promise to deliver what PayPal originally wanted to do.
Yeah, it's funny, when I saw the PayPal announcement that they're supporting crypto, part of me thought, I was like, but PayPal is the establishment now, Like it's like, as a 20-year-old startup, to me, I think that their brand was probably started out pretty cowboy, but now it's like, well, they've had to build in the regulations. It is crazy to me that PayPal went public without being licensed as a money transmitter. It's just like wild. And they had to build in all the like regulations and fraud now. And so I was like, PayPal, I don't know that it's cool enough to attract the crowd that's interested in cryptocurrencies. But I almost wonder if it'll have the opposite effect and actually like usher people in and make it more mainstream.
I think the latter, because it's not, PayPal's not, necessarily cool or cutting edge with most of what it's doing. At least that's the perception. But the point is, it's got a huge footprint. It's got the ability to broadly disseminate something. So, if you were somebody that was running an eBay related business, as you were, it sounds like 20 years ago, right? If you were, say you're like a baby boomer now, and you were maybe in your 40s or 50s running an eBay business 20 years ago, and now you're in your 60s or 70s, and suddenly that you've been using PayPal ever since, and then there's this new easy to onboard option, whereas you'd never figure out how to get to get crypto to go to like a decentralized exchange or do any sort of transaction otherwise. Now it's just right there, and you could click it. Like, I think that's good. I think that bringing innovation to a broad audience is important. I think that's ultimately what tech should try to do. Now, not all tech is consumer facing. Not all tech is meant to be in the hands of hundreds of millions of people, because that's not what it's trying to achieve. But I think ultimately, if you're thinking about what is value, value is the ability to impact people's lives one way or the other, right? And maybe you're doing it directly or you're doing it indirectly. But if you're really in the game of creating value, then having something that can be broadly used should be encouraged. And so seeing it, even if it's not innovative, seeing it rolled out at the scale that PayPal is doing it, I think needs to be applauded, because that's a step forward for everyone. And the ability to have more, more broad usage of some of the mainstream cryptocurrencies today, that can bode well for other types of innovation in the future. That puts additional pressure on regulators, for example, to make sure that they're being responsive and being proactive to the crypto space. That's been one criticism that's held back that ecosystem and kept it kind of out of the mainstream. I think that we've had just such like helter-skelter and slow regulatory response from a number of our agencies, particularly the SEC and the DOJ, that have really held that back. So, maybe it puts more pressure on them if you've got more crypto holders to get serious, come up with rules, allow, serious startups then to enter that space, because now the rules are more clear. So I think that, there could be a positive downstream effect from these sorts of things, even if they're not that interesting or not that cutting edge.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I really think that, software is good at doing things at scale. And so really the advantage a lot of these tech companies is lowering the barriers to entry. And though lowering the barriers to entry is not always better for every single person, I think on a net portfolio basis, it's much better. And so it's exciting to kind of see PayPal open the door for Americans with crypto. Talking about Bitcoin and stuff makes me think of Coinbase. And Coinbase has been in the news recently for taking some political stances and their involvement with what they're doing at Coinbase. It reminded me of the part of the book when the PayPal team was trying to figure out, do you want to serve vice industries? Do you want to support gambling? Do you want to support porn online? Do you want to support all these different things? And I think PayPal kind of landed in one place with a balance. And I'm curious, in hindsight, what you think of that process. Do you think PayPal landed in the right spot? And it's a loaded question, because I kind of think that PayPal is kind of the brand is a little tainted right now. I don't know if that's from facilitating payments for vice industries, or if it's from the fraud and scams that sort of plagued it as the big first player in online payments. But I'm curious what you think about sort of the politics and the libertarian angle and the business angle and the brand angle, and how those all get balanced.
Yeah, it's incredibly complicated. I still have mixed feelings on it, 2 decades later, right? It's kind of like you're building a platform. To what degree do you try to police activity if it's legal activity? It's a really hard question. I don't think it's gotten any easier over time. What I think has happened, kind of like thinking about Coinbase, is that the the discussion around that subject has expanded. And so whereas you had a company like PayPal, and this was also true for eBay and for anything that again was a platform that was facilitating some form of a transaction, there's this question of like, what do you facilitate? What do you allow? How much information are you going to collect as well?
Mm-hmm.
But it's become actually more broad than that. That's almost a necessity to wrestle with that at some point, because it means you're achieving scale and significance, and those things come to you. You don't really have to think about them, for how your platform's being used when you're smaller. But now that's really gone to transcend marketplaces and fintech companies to really, it seems to just involve so many aspects of companies that have nothing to do with those things, taking a stance on any sort of given political or social justice issue. There's a lot of active debate among tech, what's appropriate for this. I belong to a small CEO group of other tech CEOs here in Southern California that meets once a month. And there's like 9 of us in this group. And believe me, throughout this year, we've had a lot of discussions just really wrestling with how different companies in different sectors, address the various social justice issues that come up. I will say this, that my sense now, kind of having both feet firmly planted in middle age at this point, so having been out in the workforce for over 2 decades, and just having observed American life change a lot over like the last 30 years, is that our society is politicizing everything now. And do not read 2020 events into that statement, everyone. I mean that more broadly, like over the last decade, 15 years, like everything is winding up in politics, and somehow there's like tribalism attached to it. And it just makes it that much more difficult to navigate the world where everything now feels like you have to have a stance or statement. Because companies, when I was starting my career, companies were largely outside of politics because they were trying to do whatever they were trying to do. And so that idea that now it becomes, a necessity to confront these things, even if it's not core to your business. For PayPal, it was core to their business. So we had to talk about and make policies around, vice transactions and other types of transactions, and how to handle that. Just as it was, how do we deal with fraud? How do we protect how do we protect our buyers? Those things were maybe not something we wanted to originally address, but you had no choice. But now it's almost because, if you employ humans, and humans are more political than they used to be, then you've got to figure out how do you navigate that as a company. So it's gotten harder. I think it's gotten harder and broader, and just entangles more companies now. And I think companies are really struggling to figure out what to do about it.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and I almost think I don't know. I have kind of this idea that companies are really taking the position that maybe, or taking the role that government should be playing in people's lives, and that's why like there's a whole slew of new fintech companies that are actually, their idea is to improve financial health, and they're selling actually to the employers, because that's the only person that kind of like cares about Americans. And so I think it might be harder to build a company, but there's some parts of it that might be easier. But it's certainly different than it used to be, and it's a pretty confusing time.
And what's interesting for fintech in particular is this sense of like needing to be politically aware and engaged, and at least being involved with social issues as they come up. It raises this interesting question, because fintech is always going to be closely associated with regulation, and regulation changes over time, right? Depending on who is, when you have political appointments, these things can shift. They can go to the left, they can go to the right. It does raise this question, like if you're a fintech company, are you going to, run that risk of being like, oh, that company's a Democratic company and that company's a Republican company, or something like that, and have political identity that could have real ramifications on your business if the control regulatory body changes. So that's just a philosophical question. I don't have any answer to that, but given that our industry does have, by definition, enhanced contact with regulators,
Mm-hmm.
it does raise this question. So I'm wondering if over time we'll see, and particularly in fintech, the pendulum swing back towards being apolitical because of that hazard. So who knows? It'll be interesting to watch over the next decade.
Yeah, right. It's like a little bit inherently political because of the relationship with the regulators. And it actually reminds me of something you wrote about in the book where right when PayPal was going public, there was increased regulatory scrutiny, and you had some suspicions that this was provoked by one of your competitors and that they reached out to the regulators and were like, hey, check out what PayPal's doing. And that made me think, I wouldn't be surprised if, and we talked about this in the book club meeting last week, if there was more of that, right? And just what you're saying, right? I don't know if there's Republican companies and Democrat companies, but it certainly seems like there's companies that are friendlier with the regulators than others. And I think it would be a real turn for the worse if that ended up having a big impact on businesses. It's almost like the patent wars for fintech, where it's just pointless destroying of value.
Agreed. I think that any situation where industries are controlled by lobbying creates a lot of risk, and it's just never going to work out well for the majority of people when you sort of have the political decision making do what the marketplace should do, right? And so I think all of us that are building tech companies one way or the other, and by definition everyone in this book club, right, is interested in doing that in some way, shape, or form. There's a reason that that everyone here is involved in fintech. It's because we want to build something of value, and that's best done through the marketplace. That's best done by creating something that either businesses or consumers or both can utilize. And if regulation is there to provide guardrails and to set the rules of the playing field, but if it gets to an extreme where you're able to lobby and kind of put competitors out of business, then you're in a bad situation because it's no longer laying out the rules of the game. It's actually picking the winners and losers.
All right. Well, I just have one more question for you, and it's a real softball question. And then, yeah, if there are other questions, it looks like there's some questions in the chat. Go ahead and put other questions in the chat, and we can do some questions from the audience. But the PayPal wars, we're reading books in Fintech Book Club. PayPal Wars was probably the most fun to read. It's a very well-written book. I looked up your background. You have a writing background, so it makes sense that the book is so well-written. I'd love to hear about the genesis of the idea for writing the book, though. Like, how did that come about? Did you go into this experience always planning on writing about it? Did you take notes, or was it only after it was over, or how did it come to be?
Well, I'm definitely a note taker. We were talking about that before the session started, right? So the notes were there, but it was really more of a byproduct of what had of the experience. Definitely did not go into PayPal thinking that there was a book to be written about it. I liked writing, and I probably thought I had a book in me, but I never would have expected that it would have been from this startup that I was joining in December of 1999. Like, it's hard to go into something thinking that it's going to lead to a big project like the book ultimately was. It really was just the realization of having lived through it and looking back and thinking, oh my God, that was crazy and exciting and kind of incredible. And that's a story that needs to be told. And I'll give myself this, like I look at all the different opportunities I've missed or mistakes I've made over my life, and I realize, like, this is one of the few times where I had some foresight, because I realized, like, the group of people that I'd worked with were really amazing. I couldn't have guessed, to the extent to which they would go on to sort of rewrite the history of Silicon Valley. But I think I did call that one. So it really was just coming out of that experience thinking like, damn, this needs to be chronicled. Like people need to know about this. And then I thank you for the kind words about the book. I hope it was readable, because that's really my ultimate goal, was to say like, look, this story was good. There's a lot of lessons to be discerned about it, but I don't want to write something that's pedantic, that's acting like a normal business book. I wanted to tell a story. The lessons can kind of emerge from that, show rather than tell. And so that led me to say like, look, let me try this as like a first person story, in the trenches, have a non-omniscient narrator for the most part, that's kind of leading you through it. But those lessons emerge, and I've seen people write far more intelligent analysis of my own book than I have, kind of talking about some of the stories and lessons that come out of it. And that's great, because I think if you do a good job of creating some sort of a work, then it no longer is yours, right? Once you've published it, it's there for other people, and they can make of it what they will. And that's been really fun to just see that continues to have an impact on people all these years after I wrote it.
That's so cool. And I certainly appreciate that you showed rather than told, because I think you can hear the message. And, we were talking at the very beginning about pivoting and startups that I talk to now. But I think a lot of founders are like, this can't be normal, how painful this is and how brutal the process they're going through. And so when you show that in the book, which is like, look, this is not a fun process to bring a startup and get it up off the ground. And there's a lot of angst and a lot of turmoil. It really helps people keep going. So I think that's a cool part of the book.
It's always good to know you're not the only person that feels crazy or is somehow suffering, right? It's good to know that that's kind of a universal experience and par for the course when you're building a company. And I guess it could come back to physics, really, right? I mean, the law of inertia, the world doesn't want to be changed, and so if you're actually going to overcome inertia in the world, it takes a huge amount of force to be able to do that. So that's something that's, I think, a valuable lesson for anyone starting a company, and hopefully my book's inspired a few people along the way to maybe not give up or just keep pushing, because failure is always the default outcome in these things, even when you're a Peter Thiel or an Elon Musk or a Max Levchin. So I think just understanding like what they and those of us who worked with them had to go through to achieve success is, it's a good lesson to share.
I like that. All right. Well, we have some questions from the chat. So Daniel asks if anyone was upset when you decided to publish the book.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's you have to navigate that when you publish a book, for sure, right? And so I had a variety of different reactions to that, but I'd say actually, by and large, pretty positive. And in fact, looking back now, I think strongly and almost uniformly positive. I think people that might have been surprised by it now come to appreciate the fact that story was chronicled. Is it the way that anyone else would have told that story? Of course not, right? But it's also not presented as like a definitive history. It's very much presented as kind of, limited from my point of view. And I think people really appreciate that now. So I'd say that while it definitely surprised a few folks when it came out, I think people are really, by and large, really appreciative that it did, and that it chronicled aspects of that crazy, amazing story.
Well, feels good. Last question from Charlie. He asked if there's anything that you wish you had included in the book that you didn't, any experiences you had that you were like, shoot, wish they were in there.
Yeah, for sure. And I won't give any of those away. I think probably a new edition of the book needs to be done at some point pretty soon here. So that might be some material for a future edition. But I think I'd like to include some more anecdotes, more material about some of the amazing people that maybe I didn't profile as much that I would have. Now, looking back, I did write a lot about Peter, Elon, David Sachs, some extent, Max Levchin, Reid Hoffman, and batted 5 for 5 with with those people. But there are others that I think maybe their contributions deserve some more attention just because of their subsequent role in Silicon Valley history. So I'll have to sharpen my pencil and get back to work for some future edition. But but big picture though, when you're telling a story like that, you're never going to catch everything, and the important point is to capture the important points. And if I was able to just, in some sense, give people a taste of what it felt like, give people some sense of the the odds had to be overcome, and maybe pass along some lessons, then I'll declare mission accomplished, and and be happy with what I put together.
All right, Eric. Well, that's all we've got for you tonight. Thank you so much for doing this fireside chat and talking to us. I mean, it's like, I'm so honored to get to talk to the author of the book that we've read. We get to ask you questions. We didn't talk at all about CapLinked. Do you want to tell us briefly what you're building there, and then if there's anywhere online that people can go to find out more about you and CapLinked?
Sure, I've actually got a couple of companies now. So CapLinked is a platform for securely sharing information between companies. So we provide a lot of tech around virtual data rooms and other sort of secure sharing for due diligence. So we have customers like Amazon and Ernst & Young, KPMG, that use it often in transactional situations. So for anyone doing like a capital raise or managing intellectual property or board communications, it's a good platform for that. I've also recently launched and spun out a company called TransitNet. TransitNet is still pretty early stage, but that is blockchain related. We're building a title registry for crypto. So for companies and service providers and individuals that would value actually being able to attach title to crypto, that's hopefully going to be a valuable service in the years to come. So it's a difference between, everyone wants some cash in their wallet, but you don't want to keep all your money under your bed. It's nice to have it in a title account. So that's the theory that's operating under. So CapLinked and TransitNet, you could Google them both and find them online. But otherwise, staying busy. My best and most important job, though, is not CapLinked or TransitNet. It's being a father and a husband. So that's what also keeps me busy these days, and staying sane, waiting for 2020 to come to an end. So
right. I think, yes, we're all done with this year for sure. And we're also done with this fireside chat.